Thanks for coming, everyone. And also, big thank you to Maria and Anna for organising this at such kind of short notice. It's quite amazing that it's kind of just come together in the space of a month, and they've obviously done so much work in organising it. Maria has asked if I would talk about Walter Benjamin in relation to modernist architecture, which I thought was quite a tantalising challenge in a way, because in the context of today, we've been talking about post-war modernist architecture, and of course, Benjamin dies, quite prematurely in 1940. So this whole question about how Benjamin relates to questions of the legacy of post-war architecture, I thought was, quite curious or tantalising. And I thought I'd start with discussing a set of texts that Owen Hatherley, I think he's just gone, but one of the previous speakers today, from his book Militant Modernism, he discusses a series of texts which I'm going to talk about and sort of flesh out in more detail. The texts are kind of unusual. They're not maybe what we associate with Benjamin, because there's this general view about Walter Benjamin that he's this kind of philosopher of melancholia, of nostalgia, a bit like Dürer's engraving of Melancholia, this kind of melancholic figure gazing at the broken ruins at his feet. And these texts that Owen points to at the start of his book, paint a completely different portrait of Benjamin. So I really wanted to follow that. And what I wanted to do was talk about how heritage plays into the work of Walter Benjamin, how questions of generation, legacy, heritage, inheritance all work, as well as talking about this Benjamin's fascination in some texts with a kind of destructiveness. So the texts I'll talk about are mainly a text called Experience and Poverty, which was written in a kind of catastrophic context in 1933, which marks the foundation of the Third Reich, and Benjamin's, long-standing for the rest of his life from 1933 onwards. Benjamin is in exile. He leaves Berlin and spends the rest of the time elsewhere, mainly in Paris, writing the Arcades project. So 1933 becomes a kind of turning point. And then the other text, which is not really an essay, it's quite a bizarre text, actually. It was written in 1931, and it's just called The Destructive Character. It would have originally have been a feuilleton piece, i.e. one of these kind of weird hybrid pieces that would have appeared in a newspaper. And I just think it's, kind of interesting to consider that context as well, because the sheer ephemerality of that text in 1931, it would have appeared for one day and then instantly have disappeared. And I find that kind of compelling, given that the text, as we'll see, has this kind of, strange tone throughout, and this kind of, the gravity of its pronouncements. And just to think that it would have only appeared for one day in the Frankfurter Zeitung in 1931 on the 20th November or whatever it was. I just thought that's slightly strange. I'm actually just going to read the talk, and then hopefully we can open it up to a discussion, or just talk about, how Walter Benjamin might figure in the discussion of today. In a 1933 essay, Experience and Poverty, a kind of programmatic modernist text, Walter Benjamin argues for a positive concept of barbarism based on rejecting tradition altogether. This positive concept of barbarism aims to reject the traditional, solemn, noble image of the human, festooned with all the sacrificial offerings of the past. For Benjamin, this applies, for example, to the architectural philosophies of Adolphe Loos, of Le Corbusier, and in terms of painting, in terms of graphic art, it applies particularly to Paul Klee for Benjamin. The nature of this rejection of inheritance and this rupture had been made possible in part because the relation between the immediate past and the present had been fatally disrupted anyway, in the span of a single generation. People returned from the experience of the First World War Benjamin and countless others note, not richer, but poorer in communicable experience. In Benjamin's adult lifetime, between the aftermath of World War I and the foundation of the Third Reich, which is again in 1933 when Experience and Poverty was written, human experience had been, according to Benjamin, as if rapidly devalued in the course of only a few short years. As Benjamin puts it, we have become impoverished. We have given up one portion of human heritage for another, and have often left it at the pawnbrokers for 1/100th of its true value, in exchange for the small change of the contemporary. The roots of this general impoverishment are described in another text, One Way Street, published in 1928. Benjamin writes here about how the catastrophe of the First World War had ended the utopian dream of an ideal, a kind of Marxist conception of an ideal metabolism between nature, humanity, and technology, and had turned it instead into a nightmarish bloodbath under the hands of a capitalist, imperialist ruling class, and under capital's insatiable drive for profit. For Benjamin, it seems that the inability of one generation to successfully mediate its relationship with the next runs directly in parallel with the failure of technology to mediate between humanity and nature. Just as technology had been conceived of as a mastering of nature rather than mediating humanity's relationship with it, the previous generation had simultaneously found that in their attempt to master, sort of sadistically, the future, they had perhaps left nothing to convey. Again, in One Way Street, Benjamin writes, "The mastery of nature, so the imperialists teach, is the purpose of all technology. But who would trust a cane wielder who proclaimed the mastery of children by adults to be the purpose of education?" Hannah Arendt was fond of using the phrase from René Char, "Our heritage was left to us without a testament," which she often repeated. But Rebecca Comey, writing on Benjamin, reverses Arendt's terms. In Benjamin, transmissibility often runs in excess of content. The past confronts us as a tangled thicket of exhortations, not at all lacking in testament, but producing and causing us to register a surfeit of testamentarity, an excess of testamentarity, in relation to a heritage that is kind of lacking wherever we seem to look for it. Instead, she writes, we face obscure messages from the dead, unsigned and undated, but time-stamped and addressed to us uniquely. What if the testament itself were the heritage? This is her claim about Benjamin's practice in the Arcades project, that in that work, Benjamin was writing the testament of modernity and of the revolutionary period from the middle to the late 19th century. That is, the revolutions around 1848 to the time of the Paris Commune. That's the period that Benjamin really focuses on, which is kind of, surprising in some ways. Why is Benjamin focusing on this period? Why does he not talk about the 1917 revolution? Why does he keep away from the 20th century, in a sense? Why is he holed up in this period in the 19th century? What Rebecca Comey claims about Benjamin's writing of the Arcades project is that rather than any sense of hoarding a heritage, this kind of image of Benjamin that Hannah Arendt also paints of him being a kind of diver for pearls, trying to rescue elements of the past. Rebecca Comey says that in making this elaborate filing system about the iron and glass shopping arcades that went up in Paris in the 1840s, Benjamin was registering a testament of those originary forms of urban consumerist modernity in the context of revolution, as if simply coldly marking an inventory of its various parts. In other words, he's not so much compiling a sense of meaning, but stripping these things of meaning, which I thought, I think that's kind of open to debate potentially. Comey also talks about the slipperiness of the words heritage and inheritance, she talks about a generational torsion by which I inherit you would have originally meant I bequeath to you. And this again highlights the strange generational torsions we witness all the time in Benjamin, bequeathing backwards, doing things not for the generations to come, but wanting to redeem our enslaved ancestors, or as Peter Zondi put it, finding hope in the past. Benjamin indeed described his own historical materialism as a Copernican turn towards the past, a kind of, it's a kind of like a hybrid historical materialism somewhere between Marx and Proust. In an image from his thesis on the concept of history, Benjamin writes, "As flowers turn towards the sun by dint of a secret heliotropism, the past strives to turn towards that sun which is rising in the sky of history. A historical materialist must be aware of this most inconspicuous of all transformations." In another passage from the theses, Benjamin writes, "There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on the earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has claim. That claim cannot be settled cheaply. Historical materialists are aware of that." This generational struggle between a generation which leaves an inheritance, which always comes at a price, a score which cannot be settled cheaply, and a generation which ends up festooned with that heritage or testament, or confuses the two, or is caught up in a strange covenant, a secret agreement, is also a long-standing theme in Benjamin's writing, i.e. it dates back before the Marxist period in Benjamin's thought. To give an example from an earlier fragment written 20 years prior to Experience and Poverty, in 1913, when Benjamin was around 20, he writes, "In our struggle for responsibility, we fight against someone who is masked. The mask of the adult is called experience. It is expressionless, impenetrable, and ever the same. The adult has already experienced everything. Youth, ideals, hope, it was all an illusion. Often we feel intimidated or embittered. Perhaps he is right. What can our retort be? We have not experienced anything." The bitterness of this kind of Oedipal intergenerational class struggle in this earlier fragment from Benjamin's youth, however, is transformed into a record of loss, even regrettable loss, by the time of Benjamin's writing Experience and Poverty. Here, in the later text, Benjamin writes, "Everyone knows precisely what experience was. Older people had always passed it on to younger ones. It was handed down in short form with the authority of an age, in proverbs with an often long-winded eloquence, as tales. Where has it all gone? Who still meets people who really know how to tell a story? Where do you still hear the words from the dying that last and that pass from one generation to the next like a precious ring?" The situation veers from a locking kind of inescapable bond or agreement to one of rootless disinheritance, in which what is handed down has no fidelity, pertains to no tradition. As a result, the Benjamin of Experience and Poverty says a new poverty has descended on mankind, but the reverse side of this poverty is the oppressive wealth of ideas that has been spread among people, or rather that has swamped them entirely. Ideas that have come with the revival of astrology and the wisdom of yoga, Christian science and chiromancy, vegetarianism and gnosis, scholasticism and spiritualism. Alongside these deracinated ideas are miraculous, deracinated characters oriented away from the grip of nostalgia towards the dreamlike possibilities of the near future, like Mickey Mouse, whose movements Benjamin describes as quasi-miraculous, involving a merging of nature and technology, primitiveness and comfort. Here is the paradox of a people, moderns, who have consumed and devoured everything at the very sites where the so-called experience has atrophied. It would be false to call them inexperienced, as Benjamin also points out, but they are certainly, for Benjamin, barbaric in a good way. The free taking up of random arbitrary systems like yoga, astrology, the things that Benjamin talks about, is part and parcel of this rejection, a rejection without a kind of repression of a past with an equally oppressive patrilinear system of inheritance. But the newfound freedom of the new barbarian is at the same time not a simple rejection, not a choice. It is sprung from compulsion and reminiscent of an entry in one-way street called Torso. Torso, only someone who can view their own past as an abortion sprung from compulsion and need can use it to full advantage in every present. For what one has lived is at best comparable to a beautiful statue that has had all its limbs broken off in transit, and that now yields nothing but the precious block out of which the image of one's future must be hewn. Privation is indexed towards this preciousness. The impoverished block of the catastrophized present is all the more precious as a result. There is maybe a danger here in Benjamin glorifying abject poverty, the endless diminution and reduction of existence, of inflation and catastrophe. But I think also there is a sense that by wiping the slate clean, there is always a way of securing an agency almost minimal enough to still interrupt a catastrophic tradition. In Experience and Poverty, Benjamin writes, barbarism? Yes, indeed. We say this in order to introduce a new, positive concept of barbarism. For what does the poverty of experience do for the barbarian? It forces them to start from scratch, to make a new start, to make a little go a long way, to begin with little and build up further, looking neither left nor right. Among the great creative spirits, there have always been the inexorable ones, who begin by clearing a tabula rasa. This clearing a tabula rasa also relates to a saying from Brecht, erase the traces, part of the poem sequence, Handbook for Those Who Live in Cities. It becomes an edict, a watchword for modernist architecture. And again, Owen mentioned this in the first few pages of his book. A watchword for modernist architecture geared towards a utopian classless society, to erase the traces which for Benjamin had always related to the possessiveness of bourgeois interiors, familiar from the rooms of his childhood in the late 19th century. These rooms, in which the owner had left their traces everywhere, conferred a system of habits on their inhabitants. Benjamin writes how Bauhaus, with its steel, and how glass architecture, or the promise of glass architecture, according to one of its early proselytizers, Paul Scheerbart, who's kind of been almost forgotten in the history of modernist architecture, had in opposition, these, Bauhaus and Scheerbart's glass architecture, had in opposition to the bourgeois interior, created rooms in which it is hard to leave traces. Benjamin talks about how glass in particular is a cold, sober material which resists the aura. It resists traces, it resists possessiveness. It's transparent. So it's got all these kind of utopian connotations. This is a picture from the interior of Bruno Taut's glass pavilion, which is kind of based on the ideas of Paul Scheerbart. I can't remember where it is, but I think, from 1914. As Owen also noted in his book, Benjamin in 1931 wrote about a character who embodied this modernist edict of erasing the traces, namely the destructive character, perhaps an interesting figure in relation to the modern who makes a little go a long way, making their meager materials the material of their constructions. The destructive character instead thrives on negative space, They see ways through everything. As Benjamin writes, he knows only one watchword, make room, and only one activity, clearing away. And I'll just read like 3 or 4 sentences from the text, The Destructive Character. The destructive character does his work. The only work he avoids is creative. Just as the creator seeks solitude, the destroyer must be surrounded by people, witness to his efficacy. The destructive character is young and cheerful, for destroying rejuvenates, because it clears away the traces of our own age. It cheers one up, because everything cleared away means to the destroyer a complete reduction, indeed a rooting out of his own condition. The destructive character sees nothing permanent, but for this very reason he sees ways everywhere. Where others encounter walls or mountains, there too he sees a way. But because he sees a way everywhere, he has to clear things from it everywhere. Not always by brute force, sometimes by the most refined. Because he sees ways everywhere, he always stands at a crossroads. No moment can know what the next will bring. What exists he reduces to rubble, not for the sake of rubble, but for that of the way leading through it. But how are we to treat this praise of destructiveness, which stands against the sanctification of bourgeois spaces, in light of a class struggle in which so much has been destroyed, is being destroyed by the bourgeois class itself? I.e., isn't the very real figure of the Baron Haussmann, who punitively demolished proletarian quartiers in Paris, ripping apart working-class neighborhoods in order to make room for new thoroughfares, avenues, boulevards, vistas, parks, squares, new spaces through Paris, who made architectural breakthroughs in the spirit of air, health, and life? Isn't he the true spirit of the destructive character? I'm trying to suggest that there is a pernicious element to this, possible fascination with destructiveness that Benjamin exhibits here. Or is Benjamin's destructive character a kind of anti-Haussmann? Ironically, small digression just to do with Haussmann and class. When Haussmann was drawing up plans for the redevelopment of Paris, he reveals in correspondence between himself and Napoleon III how the population of Paris, this is what Haussmann believes, were largely in favor for the plans for Paris's transformation, but the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy were for the most part hostile. He was accused by the Chamber of Deputies of creating a desert in the heart of Paris in the form of the Boulevard Sebastopol. His impulse to, if he did have an impulse to clear away the traces and make room, this impulse also found enemies on his own side, just ironically. Both sides of the destructive character, the side I'm representing as a kind of Haussmann figure, and Benjamin's destructive character, are ambiguous and clouded. Haussmann did not, of course, simply make space, find ways. The spaces made were designed to be filled by military force. Paris is clouded post-Haussmannization by a sense of what Benjamin describes as plush, something which stands in the way of truly open vistas. Haussmann's redevelopment of Paris was referred to at the time as an embellishment, so sort of additive rather than negative. Paris is musty and close, Benjamin cites someone in the Arcades project. Another citation in the Arcades from the Haussmann folder, the Haussmann convolute. Every stone bears the mark of despotic power, and all the ostentation marks the atmosphere in the literal sense of the words, heavy and close. One grows dizzy with the novel display. One chokes and anxiously gasps for breath. The feverish haste with which the work of several centuries is accomplished in a decade weighs on the senses. At the end of this entry in the Arcades project, Benjamin writes the single word again, plush. The word comes to signify the epitome of the oppressive closeness, the obsession with leaving traces of the bourgeois aesthetic. In another entry, Benjamin offers a potential critique of Haussmann's possible credentials as a destructive character. He writes, Haussmann's predilection for perspectives, for long open vistas, represents an attempt to dictate art forms to technology, the technology of city planning. This always results in kitsch. Haussmann's efforts then perhaps were not simply making room through Paris, but as some refer to them, strategic embellishments. He did not erase the traces as much as retrace his own destructive, constructive practice at the heart of the experience of Paris. Tellingly, Benjamin also cites a German journalist's musings on witnessing the Haussmannization of Paris from 1861. At first sight, it seems strange that the government made its business to preserve existing monuments. The government, however, does not aim to pass over people like a storm. It wants to engrave itself lastingly in their existence. Let the old houses collapse, so long as the monuments remain. Haussmannization was not, given this critique, simply a process of destruction, rather a kitsch reinstatement, a monumental enshrinement of traces and of class relations. In the thesis on the concept of history, Benjamin famously remarks that there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. The wider passage, after stating that the practice of historicism necessarily sides with the victors of history, reads, all rulers are heirs to those who have conquered before them. Hence, empathy with the victor invariably benefits the rulers. Historical materialists know what that means. Whoever has emerged victorious participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which the present rulers step over those who are lying prostrate. According to traditional practice, the spoils are carried along in the procession. They are called cultural treasures, and a historical materialist views them with cautious detachment, for without exception, the cultural treasures he surveys have an origin which he cannot contemplate without horror. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of great minds and talents who have created them, but also to the anonymous toil of their contemporaries, i.e. every product of culture contains within it, dead labor, exploited, the anonymous exploited labor of people who are not mentioned. There is no document of civilization which is not at the time, and not at the same time, a document of barbarism. And yet, just as such a document is not free from barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. In light of this passage, in which tradition viewed from historicism is conceived, we return once more to the methodology of the destructive character. Benjamin in the destructive character writes, destructive character stands in, and I think this is the kind of the most interesting couple of sentences in the destructive character. The destructive character stands in the front line of traditionalists. Some people pass things down to posterity by making them untouchable and thus conserving them. Others pass on situations by making them practicable and thus liquidating them. The latter are called the destructive. Paradoxically, the destructive character stands in the front line of traditionalists. This calls to mind the strange roots in the word tradition, containing the same meaning as traduce and betrayal. Passing something on, tradition, can in fact mean betraying its intentions, warping its testament. If the destructive character stands in the front line of traditionalists by passing on situations, by making them practicable, liquidating them, making them handy, a bit like how Brechtian theatre liquidates scenes and reproduces situations, then this destructiveness is possibly not the disavowal of tradition, but its inherently barbaric lifeblood. And I'll just end with just quoting the final passage of Experience and Poverty, and then maybe we can move it into a discussion. At the end of Experience and Poverty, Benjamin simply writes, "The economic crisis is at the door, and behind it the shadow of the approaching war. Holding on to things has become the monopoly of a few powerful people who, God knows, are no more human than the many. For the most part, they are more barbaric, but not in a good way. Everyone else has to adapt, beginning anew and with few resources. They rely on people who have adopted the cause of the absolutely new and have founded it on insight and renunciation. In its buildings, pictures, and stories, mankind is preparing to outlive culture, if need be. And the main thing is that it does so with a laugh. This laughter may occasionally sound barbaric, well and good. Thanks, that's it.